Hi, I'm Chris Christensen. And again, what we're going to do for this particular presentation is if you have questions, we're not going to save them till the end. I'll tell you up front what I'm going to talk about so that you can try and time your questions for the appropriate time. But we're talking about podcasting. And if you haven't heard about podcasting, you've been living under a rock because podcasting has become quite popular, especially in English-speaking countries, and we'll talk about some stats for that later on. We're going to talk about how to create a podcast, different formats for podcasting, why you should podcast, some equipment you might use for podcasting, and some various other things that you need to know if you're going to start your own podcast. First, let me tell you that a little bit about where podcasting has taken me. I've won a few awards through podcasting, including a Lowell Thomas Award from the Society of American Travel Writers, as well as being named by Travel and Leisure magazine as the best independent travel journalist because of the strength of the Amateur Traveler podcast, which is one of 5 podcasts that I have done over 15 years. I've done 1,800 episodes of podcasts, about over 26 million downloads. This year, even in a pandemic year, I'll do, it looks like about 3 million downloads of different podcasts. It's also led to some interesting opportunities like being paparazzi for the Pope for a day or getting invited to the Obama White House. Although the strangest thing I can tell you about the Amateur Traveler podcast is that if you go to get a job with a Thailand foreign ministry, which may or may not be in your career path, you'll be required to listen to 2 episodes of the Amateur Traveler and will be graded on your English comprehension as part of that exam. Let's talk about what a podcast is. So a podcast, I'm going to focus predominantly on audio. Sorry, I apologize here for a second. It's dark early here where I am in California. The sun is just still coming up, so I'm a little sleepy. If I trip over my words, it's not because I'm not a podcaster. But a podcast is a media file, typically these days audio. And I'm really going to focus almost entirely on audio, even though 1.5 million of the downloads that I've gotten are for one of my video shows. We're going to be talking about audio. And a podcast is really an audio file and an RSS feed. And you don't need to know that anymore, fortunately. It's an audio file. And then if you use a hosting service, we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, you just need to take an audio file and upload it to a particular hosting service, and you've got a podcast. And they'll deal with all of the technical difficulties of that. So I'm hoping by the time you get to the end of this presentation, you will feel confident that you could make a podcast if you know how to record an audio file. Why podcast? So podcasting has become more and more popular over the 16 years. It's 16 years and 1 month since podcasting was introduced. Podcasting was introduced in 2004. I started in 2005. I thought I was late to the game, but it turns out that podcasting has been growing. All the stats I'll be showing, we're going to have a real US slant, and I apologize for that, but that's the best place we can get stats right now. Edison Research in the US has been doing surveys of podcasting listening since 2006. So they're really a great source of information. If you're looking at other languages, they're going to lag this number of years. If you're looking at other countries other than the US, they're going to lag this a little bit too, but it gives you an idea of what's happening in the growth of this. You'll hear people talking about podcasting, was big at one time and then it faded and then it came back, and it's just not at all true. Podcasting has been growing very consistently. In terms of familiarity, most people know what a podcast is right now. That may not include my mother, even though I've been podcasting. Podcast listening has been growing. So this is the percentage of the US population, again, US-based numbers, that listened to a podcast within the last month, 37%, who listened within a week, 24%. And if you compare that with how many people are using any particular social media or how many people are reading blogs, it compares very favorably. In terms of where that audience is, it's more or less split 50-50 men and women these days, and it is skewed towards younger. As you get into the older crowd, you're starting to run into less podcasting, but really in that sort of 18 to 55, 60 market that is the center spot for travel, there's a lot of podcast listeners in that space since we're talking about a travel audience today. People who listen to podcasts on average listen to 6 different podcasts. So I'm not afraid to tell you to start yours because they can still listen to mine and have room to start some other podcast. I mentioned that English was dominant in podcasting. This is kind of where it is right now in terms of podcast consumption. If I look at my show in terms of podcast consumption, you can see that the top things for an English-speaking travel show are, US, then Great Britain, Canada, Australia, Ireland. But then you get to start some of the other countries, Germany, Netherlands, Japan, and such. And that may be people who are downloading from those countries, but are not native to that country. You can't tell from the stats. The other thing that has really driven podcast downloads, this was a chart that came out. I think this chart only goes through December of 2016, but you can see how the smartphone use of podcasting has really gone up. This has only continued since then. I just haven't found an updated slide since then, but basically the vast majority of podcast downloads are happening from smartphones. And so people are listening to the podcasts and they're taking it with them, and smartphones and applications on smartphones are making that easy for them to do. So why a podcast? So many of you are probably bloggers or already thinking about bloggers. There are more people that consume blogs than consume podcasts. So for instance, in the US, it's 42% of people say they read blogs. Some of them read blogs who don't know they read blogs. 21%, now a little higher than that in terms of consuming podcasts every month. But in terms of the number of people producing, well, it's 2 to 1 in terms of consumption, it's 1,000 to 1 in terms of production. A lot more people are writing blogs, and so they're going for a smaller piece of a larger pie. The advantage of podcast is that you can listen to podcasts while you drive your car, walk your dog, working out, ride your bike, do your yard work, do your housework, or actually work. I'm one of those people who listens to the podcast while I get some of the work done. You have more time in your day when you can consume podcasts. So for instance, I had a woman who wrote me and said so Amateur Traveler is a show about destinations. So she didn't know where she wanted to go to Europe. So she downloaded 50 episodes of the Amateur Traveler to listen to them to plan a single trip to Europe. Now, just to put that in perspective, the Amateur Traveler is roughly 7,000 to 10,000 spoken words per episode. If we say 7,000 words times 50 episodes, that's 350,000 words. She listened to basically 4.5 Harry books worth of information because she had time in her day to do that. That's one of the reasons why podcasts have grown, is that you can find something that you are interested in and consume it at your schedule. The other thing that you need to know about podcasting, it is a very, very personal mechanism. Personal like nothing else, except maybe video. Video has the other characteristic, depending on the type of video you're doing, of being that sort of personal connection. So for instance, I was in Budapest with a group of Amateur Traveler listeners, and one of the people who was with me started talking to someone who was at this wine festival we were attending, who happened to be an American who had just moved to Budapest. And he mentioned he was there in Budapest on a tour with Amateur Traveler. And this fellow that I have pictured here just went nuts because, the Amateur Traveler, I have to meet the Amateur Traveler. Because what happens is you're in these people's ears, you're in their head while they're walking the dog and shopping for groceries and working out, and you become their friend in a way that does not happen with blogs. So something to know in terms of what makes podcasting different. And I'm going to pause here for a second before we get into different podcast styles. Excellent. Well, let's start to head into this. There are different styles of podcasts, and what kind of devices and things you need depend on the style of podcast you're doing. So for instance, some podcasts are simply a monologue. You turn on a microphone, you talk, you turn off the microphone, you have an audio file, you upload it to your hosting provider, you've got a podcast. And they are the easiest to schedule because it's just you. And once you get good at speaking, they're the easiest to create, although it's harder to create a podcast that is compelling with a single person's voice. Some podcasts are, especially monologue podcasts, are scripted, where somebody literally writes out what they're going to say and then reads it or performs it, preferably performs it in the sense that they don't sound like they're reading it. And some of them are off the cuff and then potentially edited to get them in some shape. And we'll talk about editing later on. But if you're going to do this style of podcast, we talk about what sort of equipment you will need. The easiest way to do it is you've got a computer, you've got a microphone like a USB microphone. This is a Blue Yeti microphone, which is what I'm talking into at the moment. It's a relatively inexpensive USB microphone. There's a number of things that are sort of in that range. And then if you're going to edit the show, you have something like GarageBand on Mac or Audacity or some sort of program that lets you edit or compose it depending how much you're going to do. And we'll talk more about editing later again. So that's one style of podcast is monologue. I say I'm going to basically talk about a particular destination. I talk and it's just me. Versus a different setup if you're going to do remote interviews, for instance, co-hosted roundtable kind of podcasts. And so here's some examples that Amateur Traveler is mine. This Week in Travel is also mine, along with some co-hosts. That's a roundtable show. So Amateur Traveler is an interview show. Extra Pack of Peanuts, also an interview show. Budget Minded Traveler, now rebranded to Jump, is a combination of sometimes an interview and sometimes a monologue. And you can do that. You just have to pick what your style of your podcast will be, whether it will always be an interview, whether it will be monologue sometimes. And you do that based on your audience and your content focus, your topic. And so with this sort of things, again, fairly simple setup. As the host, you've got the same kind of setup we talked about before. This is, again, my setup for doing that. And then if I'm doing an interview show, then the interviewee also has either a computer with a microphone, maybe built-in speakers in the microphone and a pair of earbuds, or actually one of the easiest things to do is to get your interviewee, your guest on. I interview with remote interviews with Skype. There are also a couple other different software that's available that you can do web-based interviewing these days. But getting them on Skype and a smartphone with earbuds actually works just fine in terms of audio quality, and it's easier for them to set up than trying to do something fancy. When you are interviewing somebody who is not a normal co-host, but a guest who doesn't always do podcasts, you're going to have more issues with sound quality and consistency, and you're not plugging in right, and you're going to have to plan on futzing a little bit with the sound quality ahead of time. That's one of the reasons I recommend that smartphone option. Is everybody knows how to use their smartphone. So get on Skype or something like that and get them on earbuds, get them not to play with the earbuds or have them brush against their hair, and it's fairly easy to get a guest on that way. Versus, for instance, Travel with Rick Steves, for instance, is a radio show that is coming out in podcast form. Again, sometimes that happens. So you can use your content in different ways. And so he's doing in-person studio interviews. This can also be true of co-hosted, where you have control of what's going on. You can do in-person things, and that is quite common. So it's going to be a little different setup. So for instance, you can have a mixer and a couple microphones and headsets, so you're sitting in the same room. Well, now you want to isolate from each other so that you're not getting crosstalk on the microphones. And so that's why you've got your headphones on and you're listening to each other, looking at each other. The advantage of this is you're not interrupting each other as you are when you're doing remote, because you can see each other when somebody else is going to talk. But you can see that on the left there, that's a little more involved in terms of audio production. You may in fact need an engineer at this point to manage the levels. Some places do, some don't. Or on the right, you've got a digital recorder. This is a Zoom H4 digital recorder. The newest version, I think, is the H6. You can put that in the middle of the table and do a recording. So for instance, here's some friends of mine doing a non-travel podcast. This is Marketing Over Coffee, and this is their setup. And basically, they have a regular co-host. It's always the same people. They have a portable setup that they were using for many years, where they were recording in coffee shops and getting some of that ambient background noise going on, but they're recording into a digital recorder. No computer involved in the recording process. And then the other style of podcast is the in-person interview podcast. And I think of Betty in the Sky with a Suitcase. Betty is a flight attendant for a major airline, and her podcast is predominantly recorded in the galley of airplanes or in the van on the way to the hotel. with flight crews talking about different stories that have happened. And so she's got a mobile recording unit. I believe she's using something like that Zoom recorder again on the right. There are also solutions where you can record into a smartphone, for instance, using something like an iRig microphone. You probably don't want to use your built-in microphone on the smartphone, but you can plug in something that plugs in. Now, this one plugs into a microphone jack, so you'd have to find one that is more recent that plugs into a lightning port, or depending on what kind of ports you have. But basically, you can use that mobile device as a recording studio, as it were. And then there's roundtable shows, and roundtable shows, again, like This Week in Travel, you can also do just in-person ones. So for instance, sometimes you can do something as simple as everybody gathers around a big microphone that basically has good quality within the room. You can listen to this recording if you go back in This Week in Travel to a roundtable show we did in the Four Seasons in San Francisco. And despite the fact that we're 7 of us sitting around a microphone, once you have processed that, it picks it up rather well. So there's the different styles of things. Then you have to think about what your format of your show is, what your topic is. And there you need to think about who your audience is and what your goals for the podcast are. For instance, if your goal is just to make money, then you're looking for something that is either very popular or very lucrative. If you're doing something that is more niche, that's going to be harder to build an audience. But the more niche you go, the more rabid your audience will be, potentially. And I think of, for instance, Lou Mongello's WDW Radio, which is just focused on Disney parks, for instance. That is a rabid fan base. And, I think of some of the podcasts that are just focusing on digital nomads, just on people who want to get out of the office and travel the world. You're looking at potentially a smaller base than, for instance, I'm a Traveler, that's looking at all travelers, but you're looking at people who are particularly passionate about a niche. The more niche you go, the more passion you can develop. The more broad you go, the more audience you can develop. And so there's some trade-offs there, and it depends on what you're trying to do. And I'm going to pause here again. And I'm going to pause here for a sec. Other questions about hosting before we move on. We're going to move on to editing, and then we're going to talk about some of the myths of podcasting. Natalia, we have more questions about hosting. I know people want to talk about money.
What if I don't use iTunes? How to manage?
What if you don't use iTunes? How to manage? You have to use iTunes. There's no point at which you have to open up iTunes. I use iTunes to put in some of the information in an episode. When I do an MP3 episode, I edit it in iTunes, but you can do that with other programs. You do not need to use iTunes to manage. You do need to be in the iTunes directory, and I'll talk about that in about 10 minutes. Okay? Editing. So some podcasts are edited, some are not. If you edit a show, you can do editing where you just take out the real rough parts where Skype hung up or dogs barked or whatever, or you can actually remove a stutter from someone who stutters. One is obviously much more difficult than the other. The style of editing I do on my shows varies. It varies on the type of show it is, what I'm trying to get out of it, and what my budget is. So for instance, Amateur Traveler is a fully edited show. I make my guests and me sound smarter. By editing that show, we edit out the ums and the ahs mostly. We edit out where somebody's looking up a fact. That kind of editing takes about 1 hour for every 10 minutes of recorded audio and costs me roughly $10 per 10 minutes. So I do a roughly 50-minute show, and I pay an editor about $50 to edit that. I do a monologue show, not in the travel space. That show I edit myself. It's roughly a 10-minute show. I'm the only speaker. I'm very used to talking in a microphone, so you're not hearing me do a lot of ums and ahs, not a lot to edit out. That doesn't take nearly as long to edit, and it's also a shorter format for that reason, so I just edit that show myself. We do a roundtable show This Week in Travel. We don't edit at all. We cut out the beginning, we cut out the end. Once you get 5 people talking over each other, editing is just a nightmare. Just don't even try, would be my recommendation. But the reason why you edit is it makes your guests sound smarter. It makes you sound smarter. It makes a better use of your listeners' time. But some people don't like edited shows. So there's no right answer for that one. I have opinions, but there's no right answer. So, some various myths. Podcasting is hard. Podcasting is recording an audio file and uploading it. If you can record an audio file, you can podcast. So that's one. If you get nothing else out of this, I want you to go away with that. Here's another myth. There is a perfect podcast length. So here's an article, for instance, I saw that said that basically the perfect time for a podcast is 22 minutes. And the reason for that is that's the average length of a commute. The average length of a commute in the US is 25 minutes. So you should make your show 22 or 25 minutes. That is bull hockey. So in reality, 84% of the shows with over 100,000 downloads per episodes are longer than that. Some of the most popular podcasts, the craziest one in here is Hardcore History. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History comes out like once every 3 months. It's 5 hours long. It's crazy way to do it. It is fully scripted, but it is by far the largest podcast by download ever. And it's a very popular show, but when it hits your feed, you know that you're going to be busy for a while. But on the other hand, some shows are very short. So I listen to a couple of shows that are 5 minutes long or longer. I listen to one show that is news headlines that is only 1.5 minutes long. And so short shows are also popular. There is no right length. So the joke goes that a podcast basically ought to be like a mini skirt. It ought to cover everything that's important and be short enough to be interesting. So there are popular shows of all sorts of lengths, and you just need to have the appropriate one for the content you're doing. Roundtable shows tend to be longer because it's easier to keep up a conversation when you've got 4 people just trying to butt into a conversation and talk about things. They're easier to do a longer show if length is of interest to you. Myth: podcast means ad supported. So we had questions say, how can you make money with podcasting? So, and this is where I said there's some good news and there's bad news. The good news is there are advertising supported podcasts, and advertising in podcasting is growing, although slower than I would like. We'll see more ads in this fourth quarter of the year than we will in other parts of the year, just because it's advertising and advertising works like that. The people I know who are making the most money on podcasts are not necessarily doing advertised shows. So for instance, I mentioned Lou Mongello from WDW Radio, who does probably the most popular travel podcast. I think Lou's a great guy. So, but his show, he has a co-host, and his co-host runs a company that books travel to Disney. So he generates business for his co-host, who is also his business partner. And they basically generate business. And what they're doing with the podcast is they're establishing themselves as Disney experts so that when you go to book your trip, you use them. That is a by far more successful business model than advertising. Advertising comes and goes. If you want to book your own advertising, it takes work. If you want to book through a different network, obviously you can do that. Now there are some of the different providers that will do inserted ads. They will tend to be more remnant ads. When you're thinking about advertising and podcasting, if you're thinking about inserted ads, think about $25 CPM, $25 cost per thousand. We'll talk about how many downloads people get for different shows. If you think about ads that are more custom host read ads and things like that, which may or may not be inserted, then you can see that value go up, maybe $35 CPM, something like that. But there are other options other than advertising supported. Affiliates, since we're at Affiliate Summit, let's talk about affiliates. The disadvantage, I said there was some bad news, and one of the bad news is when you're listening to a podcast, you're, remember, in the gym, in the car, at work. And so it isn't the greatest direct action medium, because I may phone maybe in my pocket when I'm doing this. And so don't think about people immediately responding to this. Podcasting is better, for instance, to establish authority, to establish a brand, to get people on your mailing list because they like what you have to say, and then to think about doing affiliate sales. So it's less useful potentially for direct click affiliate links. And that's the bad news in an affiliate summit. So the other thing we talked about is, okay, now I've built my show. Obviously the money rolls in because everybody's listening. If you build it, they won't come. You do need to advertise podcasts. How do you advertise podcasting? How do you get people to listen to your podcast? And one answer is the same way you do with anything else. So if you have newsletters, if you have blogs, if you have advertising, you can advertise podcasts, and you have probably seen advertisements for podcasts, so you know that that is true. In terms of advertising that is more effective, especially if you have a smaller or no budget, the people who are easiest to get to listen to a podcast are the people who are already listening to a podcast, right? Remember that stat that I showed you a while ago, which was the average person who listens to podcasts listens to 6. Now, some of us, I subscribe, I don't know, last time I checked, I subscribed to 70 podcasts or something like that. So some of us are crazy. And we listen at double speed. We don't listen at, regular speed to podcasts. So the people who listen to podcasts are more likely to listen to new podcasts. So if you can get yourself in front of people who are listening to a podcast, that is the easiest way to get a show discovered. And so getting yourself as a guest on another podcast is by far the most successful way to get people to listen to your podcast. One of the things that I did over the last few years before COVID was I was doing a segment for a popular tech show on Tech and Travel, a 1-minute show, a 1-minute segment every week, just basically putting out there some information you may need to know if you like tech and you like travel. Here's something you need to know about tech and travel. And the bigger reason that I did that was to put myself in front of a bigger audience that didn't know me. And so creating something useful for someone else's podcast, for instance, I've seen various people do that. That's a good strategy. And then anything else that you do to drive traffic to things, social media, all of those sort of things. The other thing, though, you need to know, and we've hinted at it for a while, is that iTunes is important. I'm not saying that you using iTunes is important relative to the question earlier. I don't care if you use iTunes or not. You can listen to podcasts with all sorts of different things. But you need to know that by far the most podcasts that are listened to in the Apple Podcast app, and more importantly, that the Apple Podcast directory drives a lot of other podcast apps. When you go into a podcast app and you look for a new podcast, a lot of those are coming from the podcast, from the iTunes podcast directory. And so you have to be, if you have a podcast and you're not in iTunes, just don't do it. It's a waste of time. It's got to be in iTunes. But then look where else you can be these days. You can also be on Deezer and Amazon and iHeartRadio and Google and Pandora and Spotify and Stitcher and all of those places. And again, one of the reasons I recommend Libsyn is I publish once and it goes to all those places. It can also go directly to YouTube, can post directly automatically to social media, although I don't use that. And so there's advantages of using a hosting provider that will get you that reach. You want to be everywhere. Which of those is more important for you depends on your audience. A younger audience, for instance, Stitcher or Spotify are going to be Spotify is going to be much more important to you if you have a younger audience than if you have an older audience. We're seeing the growth of the podcasts just recently came out native on the Amazon devices, and they're growing rather rapidly. But be an Apple Podcast first, but not only. That being said, we've established how important it is. There are ways to get yourself kicked out of iTunes. And this goes back to a question about the copyright, for instance. If you violate copyright in your podcast, you will get kicked out of iTunes. And so that typically is music. That's the most common thing that people do. But also if you have a podcast, if I wanted to do a Disney podcast and I called it the Disney podcast and I don't own the Disney copyright, I'm going to get kicked out of iTunes. And then I'm going to lose access to, all of these people. So don't do that. So you can speak profanity on your podcast if you want to. There are no rules for that. But in iTunes, the rule is that if you want to use profanity, that episode needs to be labeled as not clean. And that's all they require. Is it's like when you buy music from the iTunes store, the parents want to know whether their kids, should listen to this or not, and so they want to know if there is explicit language. If you're using explicit language, label the show appropriately. Now, there's a caveat with that. We'll talk about it in a second. So if you use a logo that you don't own, if you have pictures of Apple products in your artwork, not so much trouble with travel shows. If you basically just stop serving your podcast, obviously they're going to take it out. And then if you have profanity in your title or your description, whether or not you mark it as having profanity, you will just get kicked out. The other thing to know is that if you have any episode that has any profanity, even if it's labeled appropriately, you won't, for instance, be able to show your podcast in India. India does not permit podcasts in the iTunes directory or in the other directories that have profanity. And so what I recommend relative to profanity is just don't use it. Just, if you can, bleep it out if you have somebody on who's a guest and such. It's just, if you don't care about India, it's fine, but it's just not worth it in my opinion. So one more slide in terms about advertising. It is useful to know that if you're going to go out and sell advertising on your show in the traditional fashion, again, not the other ways that one might make money on podcasting by driving people into your sales funnel, for instance, but going out and selling inserted ads or host-read ads on your podcast, in general, the number that most companies use is that if you don't have 5,000 monthly downloads, they're not yet interested in you. That there are exceptions to that. If you go out and make an individual deal, that's fine, but that's usually the number to think about, 5 to 10,000, something in that range. The important thing with that is most podcasts have a small audience. Again, if you build it, they won't come. So it is typical that a lot of podcasts only get, the median podcast is 145 downloads. So if you were doing more than 145 downloads, you're doing better than average. If you advertise your show and you've got good content, you should be able to do better than that, but just be aware that there's a lot of shows that don't even care. They're hobby shows. And so really only, 7% of all podcasts, if you're trying to do advertising, are sort of in your competition because they're taking it seriously enough to build up an audience big enough to do that. Now, I have a friend who started a podcast 40 episodes ago. Doing a daily show. Daily is going to build up faster, but it's going to drive you crazy. Who's down, is up to 30,000 downloads or something like that. So you can build a show faster if you put some work into it and if you advertise. But just be aware that not all podcasts are successful, and that's because not everybody puts any work at all into advertising them. Again, going back to, I'm going to do about 3 million downloads, mostly on travel shows in a pandemic year. So you have to know that that's down a bit. You can get more downloads, but it also may take time. The other thing you need to do if you have a podcast in terms of getting it out there is on your website, there's this cute little thing here, this HTML that you need to put that tells Google that associated with this web page, there is a podcast. And it's in HTML. You put this on your website, and then when people go there with Google, Google will know to associate this with the podcast. And the last thing on this topic, and then we're going to go into general questions because we're almost at the 45-minute mark, is also in terms of promotion, think of iTunes as a search engine, because when people want to find topical information, if they're looking for podcasts, if they're podcast consumers, they will often go into, and I say iTunes, but I mean the iTunes directory. They may do it through whatever app they're using, so it doesn't matter whether they use Apple Podcasts or not. But the information you put in about your show, your name of your show, don't call it amateur traveler. For instance, if you have something that is more SEO specific, use that. If you have particular topics that are talked about in an episode, put those topic keywords in the topic of the title and the description of the episode. Think about SEO for your podcast episodes as well, not just for your website, but as you're inserting this into directories, people will search for those like they search for things on the web. So for instance, I have a show now that is 15 years old and we've covered just almost everywhere in the world. And so, when someone said, I went into the podcast directory and I was looking for a show in Azerbaijan, they said, I found you because you're it. Right? A lot of people discover me because they're looking for information about a specific destination because I have a destination-based show. So what kind of content are you going to do, and are people looking for that content? And also, who are you going to have on your show? If you're going to bring guests on, if guests can also help you grow that audience because they will talk about you or cross post or put that player on their website, and that is another way to grow your audience. Is you have people on who have an audience. And that makes it much more likely that when they tweet out that they're going to be on, Joe and Billy Bob's travel show, that people are going to download that episode.